every day. So if you would like to participate this evening in the study session, you'll be able to call 1-253-215-8782. The webinar ID is going to be 950-3326-9279, pound. You'll press pound one more time to join the meeting, *9 to request to speak, and *6 to mute. So with that call to order, I would like to ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Paul.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
Vincent.
Here.
Gutwein.
Here.
Beta.
Here.
Skilling.
Here.
Springsteen.
Here.
Franks.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
LeBure. Harrison.
Here. And Mr. Mayor, I think the phone number that you, or the webinar ID number that you just gave might have been, you might have transposed some numbers. It might be good to repeat it.
I have 950-3326-8279. Okay, so a couple quick things as we go through. We're going to have a presentation. This is our third round of talking about metro districts, and certainly a complicated subject, one that some are more familiar with, especially the Development Dialogue Group. Also want to acknowledge that we've received a couple letters, one from the HBA as well as a couple citizen letters as well. The goal is tonight, what I'd encourage council is hopefully we can come to some sort of consensus on what a potential proposed ordinance could look like, with the opportunity for a follow-up meeting to discuss that and then see if we go into a first or second reading. I know that's going to be a heavy lift, but I think we can do it. I'd love to see us get that punched out by 9 p.m. tonight. So with that said, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Jay Hutchison, who's our Director of Public Works, will take it from there, and then I'll turn it over to Mayor Pro Tem David Skilling, who's kind of quarterbacked a lot of this, especially through the Development Dialogue. Mr. Hutchison, good evening.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening. Hello, Council. I just want to touch on a little bit of new information, but it's not necessarily information that needs to make any change in what you're going to do tonight. The Colorado Legislature has finished its session this year, and the House and Senate passed 4 bills that have effects potentially on metropolitan districts. I say potentially only because they haven't all been signed into law yet. And for that reason, although I'll review them at a very high level and very briefly, my suggestion might be that you not even worry about it tonight. Go ahead and decide what you want to accomplish. And because the governor hasn't signed them, I don't think it's worth agonizing too much over the details. And in fact, I'd be hard pressed to give you the details this evening anyway. But with the next steps, as drafting of an ordinance occurs, the staff will certainly take into account what does get signed into law, what does become law in Colorado, and inform you of that if it affects any of your decisions, either by accomplishing some of your goals or being contradictory to some of your goals. So we'll deal with that later. At least that's my recommendation, and not to worry about it given the number of things you have to work through tonight. There were 4 bills that were passed by the House and the Senate. One of them had to do with local government elections. It was primarily some administrative clarifications. The second had to do with the severance tax, and there's some ad valorem tax revenue credits that affect severance taxes, and they affect metropolitan districts, and that law would change how that severance tax revenue gets distributed. The third was only about special districts and primarily about transparency. It included pieces that would improve the methods for making calls for board nominations. It would require a website for most metropolitan districts with specific information on those websites. It improved the content of the annual reports. It would limit the use of eminent domain. And it also has some disclosure requirements regarding potential debt and mill levy and estated current property tax associated with metro districts. The fourth one has primarily to do with so that
and 11, and then we would circle back and try to get consensus then on all of the recommendations starting from the top. Might be the best way to handle that, as long as Jay's up for it. He has nowhere else to be, so he's up for it.
Absolutely. Mayor, shall I proceed?
Please.
Great. Number 10, which is on page 12 of what originally was the March 5th memo. It's the same memo that's in your packet tonight. Again, on page 12, begins with number 10. This is an excerpt which was referred to as C in the 2020 memo. So there are a number of preliminary recommendations here that are carried forward for this discussion. The first is at the bottom of page 12. It's identified as preliminary recommendation C1. And this really has to do primarily with using a consultant to do some of the review. As you know, metro districts don't come up often. Some of the financial planning isn't the kind of thing that a city does in its routine business. So having the city choose and utilize a consultant to review cost estimates and the financial plan probably makes good sense for the city, and that's the recommendation. C2 is on the following page, and that's a suggestion that the financial plan be clearly based on the actual estimates of the costs that the district will take up. That seems like a very logical step, and it would fall from utilizing a consultant as I described in the preceding recommendation. So I think that one's pretty straightforward. Moving on to page 14, you'll see C3. And this is to put a maximum debt mill levy. This is something that's done fairly commonly. The key here, or there's two specifics to this I want to point out. Well, maybe three. The first is that the debt mill levy caps the number of mills that properties would pay in the district for debt. In this particular case, what we've suggested is that it certainly should include any proposed districts that have residential property. Maybe less important if it's all non-residential property. And then in addition to that, it should limit the term of that debt to an X number of years. I might mention that this is the one also that probably should be considered on a case-by-case basis. Districts can vary dramatically. They can be large, they can be all residential, they can be small, they might be all commercial, any combination of those kinds of things. And the types of improvements that they're intended to fund can vary widely as well. Those things have to be defined in the service plan, but for those reasons, it may make sense to set the maximum mill levy and the total amount of debt maximum at, the duration also at based on the exact district that's proposed and the improvements that are proposed to be paid for, rather than setting an exact mill levy maximum today for all districts forever, all time into the future, as an example. C4 would include a statement in the bonds. So when a district sells bonds and gets revenue, that's the debt that often, or a large part of the debt, or can be all of the debt in some cases, that the district would be paying off with its debt mill levy. The thought behind this one is that let's tell the bondholders, those who actually loan the money to the district, right up front, that there is a limitation on how much the district's going to pay back. So it essentially repeats the previous numbers, but it puts it into the bond documents so that the purchasers of the bonds know that they can't go to the district for anything. There's a limitation on what they'll be able to get. C5 is a suggestion that there be a certification from an independent financial advisor that the debt's reasonable. That's for privately placing debt. Now, sometimes the debt is placed in a public open marketplace and the marketplace will set the rate for the debt. In other cases, it may be placed privately where it's not in the same competitive environment. And in that case, having an independent financial advisor identify that the debt rates are competitive would seem logical. C6 is on the following page, on page 15, and that has to do with ongoing costs. There's a period of time where the developer controls the board, and I think we've talked about that extensively, and I'm sure you'll talk about it more this evening. In some cases, metro districts have ongoing day-to-day costs beyond the debt costs. For instance, if a district provides certain amenities, they may have operational costs associated with those amenities. It might be something as simple as a pocket park with a playground. They have to mow the grass. It might be something more elaborate like a recreation facility that's owned by the district, and you have to pay the utilities and all the other costs of that operation. So this would predefine a reasonable estimate of those costs for the period of time that it's going to be controlled by the developer, and an estimate for future costs as well, so that people know going in what those ongoing costs might be. We talked about the debt costs. This is also making people aware of what the ongoing costs would be. C7 is at the bottom of page 15, and that has to do with other kinds of revenue. In addition to debt, metro districts can charge fees, but they shouldn't be used for the same kinds of costs that you set mill levy caps for. If there's a mill levy cap, which caps how much money is going to be available for debt repayment, we don't want to go around that inadvertently by allowing a district to also charge a fee that's used for the same purpose. So if there's a cap, we want to make sure it's a cap. Now, they may charge a fee for use of a recreation center, as an example. That may be fine. That's more of an operational cost anyway. But we don't want to inadvertently go around the intended cap on the debt. C8 is at the top of page 16. And this is a don't compete with the city clause. In short, there are grants available that metro districts can apply for, as can a city, because metro districts are quasi-governmental. It may be fine, but what this recommendation suggests is that unless the city concurs, the district should not compete against the city for grant funds. C9 is partway down page 16. This has to do with distribution of the specific ownership tax. It's kind of a complicated thing. I talked a little bit about it in an earlier meeting, but essentially what happens is that when you register your motor vehicle each year, a portion of that is a specific ownership tax. That specific ownership tax is shared proportionally among all entities that impose a property tax. So prior to a metro district being created, there are fewer entities that are receiving that tax. So every time a metro district's created, some of that is siphoned off, not siphoned off, that's not the right word. By state law, it's distributed in a different way. And I think in the earlier part of this memo, there's a description of how much money would otherwise be going to schools, Jefferson County, the city of Lakewood, if there were no metro districts. That's obviously not the case and won't be the case, but it's an example. So this would suggest a state law change. That did not come up in the state legislature this year, as far as I know. I think it's a complex thing for the state legislature to deal with. So I don't know whether C9 is practical. You may still want to pursue it, and that's great, but I don't know whether it's practical since it's out of the city's control. Consequently, C10 is offered as well. C10 would ask or require districts to take those funds that they would otherwise keep that are from the specific ownership tax, and they could be remitted either to the city or to the other entities that otherwise would have received that specific ownership tax, like the school districts in the county and the city. That's something the city could do with future metro districts, is reclaim those funds. Mayor Pro Tem, I think that's the last item in 10. Do you want to stop at that point, or do you want to continue on into 11?
No, I think you just keep going. Let's just ride on through to 11, and then that would finish it off. And then we can, either come back to what you had just talked about, or we can just start all the way at the beginning.
Great. On number 11, really has to do with the some of the relationship between the city council and the metropolitan district when the metropolitan district wants to make some changes. So H is what that was referred to in the earlier memo, and H1 actually shows up on page 18. And H1 is the beginning of a way to deal with this. There is a provision in existing state law that requires substantive modifications. Actually, the phrase is material modifications in a service plan for a metropolitan district to be approved by the city council. So chronologically, the city council approves a service plan for a new metropolitan district. The district is formed. If the district then wants to make a material change in that service plan, they're required to obtain the approval of the city council. The challenge is defining what a material change is and agreeing between the metro district and the city what a material change is. H1 is a start on that process. H1 would require that in the service plan that originally would be adopted, that a list be included of things that on their face would be material changes. So there's an example list up there earlier in the memo on page 17 and 18. So that's recommendation H1. However, it's difficult to be perfect in predicting what might be a material change. Something may come along that no one thought of and might not be included in that list. So then the question becomes, how do we make sure that gets on the table and the city council and the metro district get on the same page about whether some action in the future that we don't know today is a material change or not? And that's H2, H3, and I believe H4. No, I'm sorry, it's H2 and 3. I'm sorry, it's H2. Well, let me just go through H2 and then we'll find out where we go from there. H2 applies when a metro district believes an action that's in the list that I mentioned a moment ago doesn't rise to the level of being a material modification. So it is something that's in the service plan that says it would be a material modification, but for reasons we can't anticipate, it turns out to be so minor, even though it's on the list, that the district thinks it's not a material modification. H2 would require the district to bring that up and explain to the city council why it's not a material modification. Then the city could respond within a period of time and either concur with the district's assessment or not. If not, we'd go on to H4, which I'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. So that's H2. That's a case where the district board believes it's not a material modification. H3 is the opposite, where the city believes it's a material modification and notifies the board. And a similar process would play out. If the board agrees, obviously it has to come to the council. If the board disagrees, we need a solution to that situation, and that is H4. H4 is the resolution process in either case, whether the district or the city. Well, if the district and the city cannot come to resolution under the previous recommendations, it goes to H4. And H4 is simply kind of an alternative dispute resolution approach, so that there's some kind of a step before you have to go to court. In state law today, if there's a dispute over whether a material modification happens, the only option really is to go to court. This inserts a step before having to file a lawsuit against the other party. That finishes 11. Uh, 12, beginning down in the lower part of page 19, only has, I think, 2 or 3 specific recommendations. The first is to be clear about what services are available, what services the district can provide. and who they're available to. There can be district provided services that are available to the city, all citizens, city or not even outside of the city. For instance, there might be a trail constructed with some kind of a shared use path of some sort, and it's in general open space, and the intent is for the general public to use it. The district's not going to have people tossed off the trail if they don't live in the district. We just need to be clear about that. And more importantly, we need to be clear when there are district facilities that are only available to district residents. That might include the recreation center that I mentioned earlier, or perhaps the fees are different if a non-district resident uses a recreation center. I'm sure we're all familiar with situations where out of district or out of city residents may pay a different fee than in city or in district residents. I believe that's E2. And then E3 has to do with services being provided outside of the district by the district. The general intent is for the folks who pay the bills to get the services in the facility. So those are the district property owners. But in some cases, there may be logical reasons for the district to reach outside of its service area a bit. And one of the examples here, as I recall, is a situation where the district's going to be reimbursed for those services. Another might be where there's a future plan for a utility that crosses district service lines, and because of the topography, it makes sense for the district to go across a gulch when they build their own facilities. They may have to stretch upstream to connect to an existing provider or provide a bit of a connection to the downstream future provider. So there's those kinds of things. And there's some bullet points under E3 on page 20. I think that concludes it. The one thing I didn't point out were if there are any situations where it might be looked at differently, depending on whether there are or are not residential uses in a particular district. Generally, these recommendations, the staff believes should be applicable in both cases. There are a few where it may not be necessary on non-residential districts that have no residential within them. I think that concludes my thoughts. Thank you.
So at this point, Mayor, do you want to go to public comment on any of these, or should we just start then with the discussion going back to page 4, I suppose is in the packet, and starting with recommendation 1, and now we can just go through 1 through basically 12.
Yeah, let's do that 1 through 12. Let's see where we can get consensus, and then we can maybe areas where we don't, those could come through at a, well, let's think about that. My hope is, I think earlier we went through quite a few of these with pretty good consensus. So let's just see if we get through to that. So why don't we head that way? Councilor Bida, your hand is up.
Yes, just a point of clarification, Mayor. If we're going to start going through the recommendations, this is seems out of order in terms of the way this is numbered, but in terms of the logic, it makes sense. And that is that seems to me, we should start with number 9, which is discuss whether to have a city council vote on whether to prohibit additional metro districts. So it seems to me that's the first question, and that should be discussed. And then if the answer is no, we should not prohibit, then we start going through them. And I would note that we didn't really have any presentation or discussion as to what that would mean, in terms of the logistics of the building, if we were to prohibit these districts. And it seems to me that's been left out. And I don't know if we want to have Mr. Hutchinson address that, but that would be my suggestion, is we go to number 9 first and have an explanation as to what that would mean.
Okay. So just a real quick check. I thought that we did have consensus that we wanted to continue looking at metro districts because we would have negated probably having tonight's meeting if we didn't want to go forth, but maybe somebody could refresh my memory. Councilor Franks or Ms. Franks, your hand is up.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. I was just going to say that was my recollection. Now, certainly the same as yours, that we had there was more consensus to move forward. Certainly that doesn't take it off the table once we get to an ordinance. We should be prepared for that, but we hadn't taken off the table. But I was questioning the reason why I originally raised my hand was public comment. I certainly would like to hear from the public, in my view, before kind of trying to build consensus, because there may be points that I have not considered that would factor into kind of where I would kind of place my, my thoughts. So I didn't know if that would be possible to kind of, or if you were already planning on doing that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Skilling.
Well, I think for purposes of the study session, I think it's important to go through each of these and discuss them. And in doing so, at the end of that, and when this comes to a second reading, it very well may be that we go through all of this and say, even with this draft ordinance, we don't think that we think there should just be a prohibition on these. That could be the case, but I don't see how we can get to there until we discuss all of these possible reforms. That's the whole point of it, is to see if we can put enough of these guardrails, whether it's disclosures or in the finances, to make these things palatable and make it a useful tool in our toolbox, whether it's affordable housing or whatever it is. But I agree with Councilor Beta's point that will certainly be a question. But I think that's probably going to be an actual vote come second reading, I would think. But that would just be my 2 cents, because I don't want to just get consensus here and say, no, we don't want to do that. We want to move forward, and that be the end of it. I think that does deserve an actual vote if somebody wants to make that motion at second reading. I think that's fair.
Ms. Harrison?
Thank you. So questions that we might have about the 3 questions that we just went through, do you want to hold those until we come back and we're doing our consensus discussion, or when do you want those questions about those 3 questions about the questions?
So I think what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and go to public input. We'll hammer that through, and then we'll start at the very beginning and we'll go section by section. There are questions, and we can take those section by section, and then we'll try to get consensus going forward. And I think what Mr. Skilling said, and also what Ms. Frank said, there was a consensus to move to this point. And certainly if a draft is done and council does not want to see metro districts, there's a majority, then that can certainly be a no vote on second reading.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and open public input, which is your opportunity this evening to weigh in on any of these issues related to this topic tonight. Anything that you see that you would like to see added or not. You'll have 3 minutes. I will try to let you know when there's 30 seconds and ask you to wrap up. When you are called, please give us your name and address, and I will start your time. Mr. Clerk?
We have John.
All right, John, give us your name and address and we'll get you started.
Good evening, John Henderson. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. What got an
Yes.
address for us, or just somewhere from Maine?
Address 16 Shaw Road on Westport Island. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to say that we had the pleasure of spending a lot of time with the state legislators the last several months. I testified at 2 hearings and had numerous very productive conversations with the legislators, and I'm happy to share those experiences with you all if anyone is interested. I wanted to address quickly 3 points. First of all, with respect to the finances. This came up during the debates with the legislators, and they quickly got to the heart of the concern expressed by the citizens, and that is finding a financial consultant in order to perform these oversight duties who is free of influence from the development community. As we know from our own experiences in Solterra, the financial consultant was on the payroll of the developer and simply used numbers that the developer provided, which was of really no value. That's a difficult issue, and I don't know how you do that unless you have a staff person whose loyalties are to the city and to the public, somebody who is a public servant who isn't in the business and isn't making money, reasonably so, in working with the development community. So that's a tough issue. Legislators saw through that, and the provision that was excluded from the final bill, in large part through our efforts, turned on that issue. They were not satisfied with the developer's assurances that this consultant would be independent. With respect to the disclosures, I sent to you all today a pared down list of key disclosures that are very simple to collect. They're already available in all the documents. And if you all created a website that listed these disclosures for all metro districts, I guarantee you that the real estate agents who are desperately hungry for this information
30 seconds.
We'll go to that website and get it. The last point, whether you have a district or not, I've shared those data points with you and the experience with Longmont, and I urge you to seriously have that debate. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, sir. Mr. Clerk, next.
At the moment, no other hands are up.
All right. If you'd like to speak, please press *9. *9 to request to speak. Going once. Going twice. Closed. All right, so we'll move forward. We're going to go all the way down to number 1, I think. Mayor Pro Tem, is that accurate with disclosure to potential end users?
Yeah, so number 1 in the bold in the packet is listing out that there should, the gist of it was, I'll just refresh everyone's memory, was you're just trying to have a single page plain English disclosure that isn't super packed with 6-point font, not a lot of legalese, that simply says this is what a metro district means, this is what you're going to pay now, this is what you may pay in the future, giving some real life examples and making it really simple, and also having it perhaps something that they also have to sign off on. And then in addition to that, having it in an MLS. That was something I know that Councilor Gutwein talked a lot about. I know there's a lot of interest in having that in MLS because to the extent that Lakewood could mandate that, and realizing that that's a tough thing to do, but if we can mandate that, to have it in MLS, I think is an important thing. We do that, MLS does that with HOAs. Sometimes you even have the estimated cost of the HOAs or prior year HOAs. You could do a very similar disclosure program there, and not just for new builds. Mr. Hutchinson talked a lot about, a lot of this is prospective on new special districts, but I don't think we need to be thinking about a lot of these things just in that box. We can do disclosures in the future. MLS is one of those ways. If a new house goes on the market and say a Solterra, there's no reason why we can't enforce disclosures on that potential sale. And that would come through an MLS listing so that they have to disclose that this is in a special district. And that would also trigger then doing this single page disclosure. We often kind of get trapped in this, the new construction part of it. We have a lot of existing homes that are in districts now. And when those get turned over and put for sale, I think these disclosures are just as important to those buyers as to the new build buyers. So I think Mr. Hutchinson is 100% correct that a lot of things, especially with service plans and all of that, is prospective. We obviously can't go back on those. But when it comes to things like disclosures, I think this is where we can really be aggressive in doing all that we can to disclose to potential buyers, whether new build or existing. So that's really what number one goes to. One of the, between the study session and when the ordinance comes before us, we obviously aren't going to tonight wordsmith what that disclosure says. We have the gist of what it needs to say, all of the big bullet points, how much you're going to pay, what the mills are going to be, what the debt obligations, all of those things. But what that actually looks like, I think we'll lean into staff on that to at least come back with some draft, or in between now and then, we can discuss what that actually looks like. And perhaps it doesn't even need to be in the ordinance, because that would be a little tricky. Maybe in the ordinance, we just need to say the single page disclosure must include the following, and then leave it to the experts to come up with that. And it's something, and that would allow it to evolve as well. Maybe we see in year 2 or year 3, the disclosures, we need this or we need that. And what I'm most interested in is making sure that the law itself, that the legislation mandates that these are the things that will be there. And to the extent we can make that into the MLS, and I'll leave that to legal, to the extent we can do that, we need to do that. So that's number one, or issue number one.
Great. Any questions on issue number 1, Mr. Abel?
Thank you, Mayor. Would it be impossible for us to require some sort of disclosure as early as an offer sheet or contract, or contract for the place is started? The first document that they really do officially. Can we do that? Require disclosure at the time they submit the offer sheet.
So let's see if we can get you an answer. Mr. Hutchison, do you want to try to address that?
Sure. I think that's very possible, Councilor Abel. I don't want to make a full promise on it right now, but I think earlier in the process, probably with a sales contract, would be possible and verifiable.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Beta.
Thank you. Just a question I have about the last point about create the opportunity for buyers to pursue a remedy. And I'm just wondering what that's going to look like, or what you would propose that would look like, because in my mind, I'm having a hard time imagining a remedy that would be of any value. You know, you could say, well, if you haven't done the disclosure, the contract's voidable at the option of the buyer, but probably most buyers aren't going to want to do that if they, once, maybe a year down the road, they find out how much they're being taxed. Well, at that point, they put all kinds of money into their home and improvements. Well, they're not going to want to void the contract, void the deal. So they're going to want to keep the house. So then what do? I guess you could have some sort of a fine, but that doesn't really do the homeowner any good. I guess you could provide for some sort of damages, but that becomes complicated in terms of determining what that is. So I guess, I don't know, maybe Mr. Hutchinson had some ideas, but I'm having a hard time imagining any remedy that would be of any value.
I appreciate your point, Councilor Beta. This is a tough question. The intent here is to give the buyer an option to pursue some kind of remedy. And I'm not sure what that would be. Clearly, they could cancel a contract if they find out They should have known at the contract time, and they get to closing, and all of a sudden they're surprised. There may be later cases, as you described, where it doesn't happen. But it seems that without ensuring in the ordinance that the buyer has the opportunity to pursue a remedy, then it may only be the city that can enforce this portion of the ordinance, which would mean for any kind of enforcement to occur, it would require the city to take action against the seller. The intent here is to expand that so that if it's a single buyer, the single buyer can pursue a remedy, whatever that remedy might be, which we'll have to do some more exploring on, rather than the city having to take that on at taxpayer expense. It's certainly not perfect, but we'll give it some more study as well.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. In going along with this discussion, is there any reason why when somebody is first looking at a home that they can't be told that this area, this home is in a metro district, number one? And number two, oftentimes in front of a home, you will see a box that has literature describing the home, footage, bathrooms, that kind of thing. Why can't that also be on that document and do it as early in the process as possible?
So I think that's a great question. I think it goes in line with what Mr. Abel had asked, as soon as somebody starts to really engage on the very front end, as well as the MLS with that information that would be listed on that sheet the flyer that you would pull out of the box would have the MLS, which could give you the breakdown. So, I think a lot of these things as staff is listening and we look towards moving towards an ordinance, legal is going to review all of this and really be able to weigh in and say, you can do this, you can't do this, this is how you would do that. And that's what the next meeting of this body would be for, but we can certainly take these suggestions down. Okay, so any other comments? Is there consensus on the first round of the disclosure? Okay, I'm seeing consensus on that, so we'll move on to the next one, Mayor Pro Tem.
And I might add just on that last point for staff's benefit too, a lot of this, if you recall after the housing crash in the early aughts, you had the truth in lending rules that came out, and one of those was they had a single page disclosure. I'd be interested to see what the remedies were and how they were enforcing that. And I realized that was, I believe, federal legislation, but it would be interesting if we're talking about remedies to see what the penalty would have been for violating those forms. I think it was like the HUD 100 or whatever it was, those single page disclosure forms that they mandated after the crash. The next point, so this is on number 2, is when we transition from the developer dominated board to the resident dominated board. Just a quick rehash, that was when you have a metro district, obviously when the district, prior to having people actually buy properties there is a board, and the only people around to fill that board are going to be developer affiliated board members. However, once there is sufficient build out and sufficient residents, a lot of what we've all heard is those residents would like to have responsibility and kind of choose their own adventure and their future and not just leave it up to the developers. So there was the 2 issues. When do you mandate that it become 100% resident dominated board? Is it in a certain amount of time, or when there's a certain level of build out? I will note something we've also heard. In many cases, when you have, we'll call it a sleepy district, meaning it's going along, maybe it's small, there's no issues, and the district has issues trying to even get anyone on their board. And they put out the notices and just there's a lot of apathy because everything is fine and nobody's really interested in it. And, whether that's a valid concern or not is probably immaterial. There needs to be, though, some type of a safety valve or something in any draft ordinance that speaks to what happens when the developer does everything we tell them to do. Notice, double notice for elections, do everything they're supposed to, and yet no one wants to participate on the board, or there isn't enough interest to fill all of the seats. What happens then? And that's something that we'll need to look at in between now and the ordinance that comes back. Is what's the answer to that question? Is it we say, well, try every then 6 months until you get a resident on there and you have to accelerate your elections? Is that an option? I don't know necessarily what the answer is, but that's certainly an issue that we need to address in the final ordinance. These two are fine. I think the easier question is, setting the years or setting the build out percentage, but we also have to look at these other issues that could arise as well.
Yeah. So Mayor Pro Tem, are you looking at well, I guess I would turn to maybe Mr. Hutchison. Do we have, I don't see a recommendation as to the actual defined time or percentage. Is that something that we want to try to discuss tonight? I don't even know where I would start with that personally.
The suggestion from staff would be to do that on a district by district basis, recognizing, as I said earlier, that districts vary dramatically. Some have many homes, some have very few homes. Some have large commercial areas, some have no commercial areas, some have no residential. The circumstances just vary enough between districts or among districts that it may be reasonable to set the percentage or the amount of time based on the specific intention of the district.
And that's something that would then be brought back before council to approve when these come before us. Is that accurate?
Thank you. Yes. In fact, probably what the ordinance would require is that those deadlines be a part of the service plan approved by the city council. So they would be an obligation of the district.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Ms. Franks?
Thanks, Mayor Paul. I just wanted to throw it out there for staff's consideration that it may be helpful to have some kind of a guiding matrix. It wouldn't be the rule, but, level of complexity, number of units, certain criteria that can feed in that can help a future council make a determination. It wouldn't be something that would be prescriptive, meaning if it fit into this box, you had to do this. But rather than everyone having to start over each time, I think there's just certain things like when you're rating a project, you're looking at level of risk tolerance, scope of the effort, numbers of units. You're looking at those things to at least get you in the ballpark of what you think is reasonable for those things. That may be helpful just as a guiding document.
Thank you. Mr. Abel?
Thank you. I agree with what Ms. Franks just said wholeheartedly. Can we, though, vary the requirements either by type of districts, size of district, without the concern of someone coming back to us and say, well, you let district AB over there get off with this set of regulations, but now you want to impose this on my district. Do we stand a legal dilemma if we treat different districts differently? Or do we have to set some criteria for that difference?
Thank you, Councilor. That's a great question that we'll certainly have to look into with some others on the legal front. I think not being a lawyer, but at a minimum, I think what we would need to do is explain why the decision is made in each case, since this would be a requirement that could vary from district to district with some explanation. Then factors that might affect one district might not affect another district in that consideration.
Thank you.
So I have Ms. Gutwein, then Mayor Pro Tem.
I'm sorry. I thought you were. I apologize. So I think that the case by case basis makes sense, and I also think that with regard to kind of the release valve conversation about if there aren't folks that want to serve, that certainly could happen. Not in the troubled districts, of course, but, I can see that happening. So I think that maybe a waiver from staff and potentially council approving might make sense if they meet, they prove that they did I'm sorry about my dog barking in the background. If they can show that they did certain things, and then we could evaluate. I just want to say, I think that the only problem I would have or concern I would raise if we had just an administrative waiver, I'm concerned about putting that burden kind of on staff and that, any perception. So it may need to be a council decision, but just some thoughts there.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem?
I just wanted we'll bring it full circle. The one of the primary reasons, one of many reasons that we have number 2 as an issue is it relates to issue number 5. And issue 5 concerns the types of debts that can be incurred later on or any changes to that. So there's one thing if you have the service plan that initially comes to council, that has some parameters in it. You're not going to be able to do this or that until and at such time that you have a resident controlled board. So those two, when we get to number 5, we can look back at this one and they kind of go hand in hand because a lot of this is you're trying to give residents who are going to be paying these mills for years and years and years and years and developers who are going to move on. We want to make sure that those folks that are still there were able to make the decisions that are above and beyond what council approved in the service plan. So I just wanted to make that clear that that's why this is so important.
Okay. All right, folks, is there consensus on number 2 moving forward? Okay, we'll go ahead and move that forward. Mayor Pro Tem, number 3.
And number 3 to what, and maybe Councilor Gutwein and Mr. Hutchinson could speak to this, but Mr. Hutchinson had said earlier about the state legislation, and I know that they were touching on some of these election issues. So for purposes of the final ordinance, there may be some overlap there. But the committee talked at length about how you are actually providing notice of board elections and publishing something as wonderful as UHub or whatever it's called may be. Nobody actually is looking at those. And so it's how aggressive do we want to be? Is it, hand delivering notices, making sure that everyone gets one, which isn't actually that cumbersome in a district, I wouldn't think. Is it just emailing and mail, some combination of all of the above? But it's really just making sure that everyone has notice of the elections and that you can do the mail-in election ballots too to make it easier on the district folks to actually vote in an election. So that's where that goes to. And I don't know if Councilor Gutwein or Mr. Hutchinson, if that new legislation affects that, I don't know. I assume that it doesn't preempt us, that we're allowed to be as aggressive as we want. And if we want to make sure that it's email notice and mail-in ballots, that we could go ahead and do that. But that's what the committee was recommending.
Right. Any questions to that section or? Okay. Is there consensus on that? And then, okay. We'll go ahead and move that forward. Number 4.
So number 4. So this is the situation where we want to make sure and to make sure there's not even the optics of having a bad actor involved in these, and to make sure that these districts are actually being used for their intended purpose and for no other. And the intended purpose is to finance the infrastructure of the development. It's not to have developers, their affiliates or their partners or whoever making money strictly on the fact that there's a district that exists, because that's not the point of it. And ultimately, the folks that pay for that would be the end users. So any of those profits is obviously money that's coming out of their pockets. And so what we're trying to, this was way back at maybe the first meeting we had as a committee on this. This was a main concern, is to make sure that these districts were not being used in any kind of a nefarious way. So the recommendations that Mr. Hutchison has on here were a lot of the ones that we talked about also in the committee, which is to make sure that you have arm's length transactions, to make sure that the interest rates are compatible, to make sure that that the developer, whoever it is not making a profit by charging interest for the money that it is then obligating the end users to pay. So however we get to that point, there's folks a lot smarter than me that can make sure those guardrails exist, but we need to make sure that these are not profit centers. And I know that that's somewhat tricky as far as how we do the language on it, but the gist of it needs to be, whether in the ordinance we have an intent, we make it very clear that here's what we're trying to do. We want to make sure that no developer is making a profit just for the sake of having a district, that has to actually pay for infrastructure. So that's what number 4 is about.
So for clarification, Mr. Hutchison, when we're looking for consensus here, you have choose one of the following at the time of district. So basically we would potentially present a menu that we would then build off of, and then council again would approve this as part of the service plan. Is that the envisionment here?
Yes, ultimately, the service plan would be the document you want to be able to turn to for each particular district. There are probably multiple ways, although not a lot, to accomplish what was described by Councilor Skilling, with the intent to make sure that those effectively accomplish the goal as he described it. We'll have to see how those fall out, how much is in the ordinance, and we may have to be fairly specific, but certainly need to have the intent crystal clear in the ordinance.
Okay. Any questions on this, council? Okay, is there consensus to move this? Okay, we'll go ahead and do that. Go to number 5, Mayor Pro Tem.
So we're already to number 5, which I mentioned a moment ago in connection with number 2. So this is when the service plan comes to us, there is the maximum amount, and that there won't be a Tabor election. Some of these service districts have this almost perfunctory rubber stamp type of Tabor election when there are no residents and it's still the board dominated. So this would be, if you're going to incur more debt or take on another debt obligation, that actually that can only be done when it's resident controlled, and you can't have your debrucing election prior to that. So you've got to actually go in a logical order and not try to circumvent any existing taxation laws just by virtue of it being a non-resident, nobody lives there. So you're having a Tabor election in which the only voters are the folks that are trying to incur all the debt. So this would, I think, do away with it. I think it's fairly straightforward. The service plan says you have X amount of debt. If you want to go past that, that's fine, but you actually have to have a Tabor election once you have a resident-controlled board. And that's it.
Great, thank you. Council, any questions on this? Ms. Gutwein.
Yes, thank you. I think in light of our conversation about, the difference between kind of a board with residents on it and, let's say, just for example, a board where it's still potentially district controlled, but there are actual residents that live in this community that just don't want to serve on the board. And so I'm wondering if what we really want is to ensure that it's the residents that are voting on the Tabor election, not that it's the board members, because ultimately what we want is to make sure that it's the residents that are voting. So that would be my only suggestion, is that we say that, you know, maybe it's preventing a Metro District Tabor election until residents can vote. I'm not sure how to word that, but I see some head nods. So seems like I'm making some sense. And then I just want to clarify that the establish the service plan maximum debt amount, that's on a case-by-case basis, or that's we're establishing a citywide maximum?
So, Mr. Hutchison, do you want to address those two?
Sure. Starting with the second one, yes, you're correct, Counselor. The maximum debt would be based on the specific district, because the improvements that districts do vary considerably, both in cost and scope. And that's a great point that you described it well, that the key is that the end users are the ones who control the Tabor election. They vote. Tabor elections are voted on by legal electors, and end users are legal electors. So as long as there are more end user electors than developer board members, the end users will control that vote. So that we will need to look at how to express that well in the ordinance.
Okay, Ms. Franks.
I just wanted to build off of that conversation there with a couple more questions. So if I understand it correctly, there obviously is a board that then would make a determination to put something on a ballot. And we're saying that the board would need to have more residents than it would have maybe a developer affiliated. So that's one piece. Is that correct? That just getting it to the ballot, that would be that board deciding. And we're saying that we want that to be more resident owners than we want it to be the other. Is that correct? I guess part one.
I think you're correct that the board would decide what would go on the ballot typically. But the decision of whether that ballot question passes is in the hands of all of the electors.
Yes.
So in the event that the board is elector controlled, then there are probably more electors who are end users rather than developer affiliates, so that the end users would probably control the election results. The exception, I think Councilor Gutwein may have touched on, is if the board is not end user controlled, and the reason is that the end users don't have enough people that want to be on the board. But even in that circumstance, where the board is still developer controlled, if there are enough end user electors to outnumber those developer affiliated board members and electors, then the end users would still control the outcome of the election. So there may be a lot of language that Mr. Dorodziak and I are going to have to work on.
Yes, and that's the distinction I wanted to make, is that there is a threshold and then there's a safety threshold. So you certainly want some kind of a margin in which you know that it's the people who are going to be paying that. So I just wanted to make sure that the people listening at home were really clear that there's really two parts to getting there. One is just even getting it onto the ballot, and two is making sure that is a fair election that correctly represents the desires of the community, whether or not they wanted to serve. And people who watch our meetings know not everybody's going to want to serve on. They're not always they sometimes thankless positions. But thank you, Mr. Hutchison, and thank you, Ms. Gutwein, for pointing those things out.
If I may just add one item to this discussion, it's a technical clarification, really. Generally, metro districts have that election of whether to debruce or not from Tabor very early on, as Councilor Skilling discussed early in this portion of the meeting about number 5. And usually that debrucing is complete. Everything's debruced. All of Tabor would not apply to most of those districts. it may be that there needs to be a narrow scope Tabor election before end users control the district. Because to have debt, the district's going to have a Tabor election. That's the way Tabor's written. This kind of a quasi-governmental entity has to have a Tabor election to issue debt and to be able to pay for that debt. So it may be that a narrowly described Tabor election could occur before end users even exist in the district at all, but it would have to be narrowly defined to only accomplish what the city council has approved for the initial debt in the service plan. So the council's decision with the service plan limitation on the debt would still be totally in effect. I just want to make the distinction that there may be a limited Tabor election, but certainly not a full-fledged debrucing type Tabor election early on.
Thanks for that clarification. Ms. Harrison and Mr. Beta.
Thank you. I could definitely support what Jay just talked about. I do want the end users to have the final decision on Tabor election, but I do like the narrow definition. That kind of helps, I think, both sides. So thank you very much.
Mr. Beta?
Thank you. One of the provisions of Senate Bill 262 that I would expect the governor will sign is that the costs, the initial costs of the improvements have to be certified by a PE, a professional engineer. So that seems to me that should take care of some of these initial problems, is that before they bring when the developer brings the initial service plan to council, that they've already got a PE certifying the cost. And the only problem I have with that is I'm not sure I want one of their PEs to get to certify it. I assume we probably have PEs on our staff that could do the same thing. I'd be a lot more comfortable with their review and certification. And I think that would at least take care of us past the initial cost. And then if at some point there was a cost overrun or, change orders or increase in prices, then they can always come back for a Tabor election at some point, as we've discussed. Wouldn't that cover that, Mr. Hutchinson, that issue?
That provision would have been very helpful, and I say would have been because it ended up being amended out of the bill late in the legislative process.
Oh,
so the council, the ordinance will need to address that as well. It would have been very helpful.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right, folks, any other questions? Is there consensus on 5? Okay, we'll go ahead and move that forward. Mayor Pro Tem?
Number 6 deals with 2 parts. Number 1, when they actually come to council, what's in the service plan, I believe on a higher level, because I think later on in some of the recommendations Mr. Hutchinson started this meeting discussing, there are some minutia points that will have to be in the initial service plan that's provided to us. But this is, I think, more of the higher level, which talks about what council's role in this will be, what the oversight will be. This speaks to the consultant that also appears in those later recommendations, that the city could assign a consultant that it chooses and then pass the bill on to the developer as part of the application fee process. And then also the periodic reports are important. I believe that right now that there's not a real robust process in which that happens. I think that districts have to file something on a yearly basis, and it doesn't really provide a whole lot of information. And I think as council has now waded more into this and is demanding a bit more oversight, I think that those reports also need to be a bit more detailed and maybe even a bit more often, especially at the front end when you are incurring the debt and doing the build outs. It may not be as important 5 or 10 years in, but certainly on the front end, when you're doing that build out, if this council and future councils are going to take on the responsibility of oversight, which I think it should, then we need to have reports probably a little bit more detailed and probably a little bit more often than just 1 year apart. And what that looks like, I guess, depends on what we're making sure is or isn't happening. Whether that's, are they meeting what their original pro forma said? Are they on track with their debt? Have they run into something where they're saying, oh goodness, we're gonna have to spend $10 million more because we ran into this topography issue that we didn't know about? You know, who knows what it is, but the residents aren't there yet to provide the oversight and the accounting on this. So that's kind of where we're filling that stopgap. Us or staff or whoever is filling that role in that in-between time when there's just dirt and when you can have that resident controlled board. And it's really, I think that's the important part of it, of where we need to receive reports, receive updates, and perhaps most importantly, have the ability for us to be proactive. We had this issue last year, the year before, it's probably the year before, when we all said, well, shoot, let's just bring them in and let's talk to them about this modification they're doing. And we found out we had no power in our service plan to do that. So I think at the end of the day, it's us just filling the role of our future residents before they get there. We're just shepherding it through and making sure that the oversight is there until they can provide it.
Thank you. On this one, I had a couple questions or concerns, but for me, I think I'll need to wait till a draft comes out to really understand how it's going to play out and what it's going to look like. So, Ms. Harrison?
My only concern, and I want to make sure that we do follow up with what Public Works suggested here, I don't want this responsibility to fall on our staff to be looking at these service agreements. I really do believe that we've got to find a consultant that does that. And I also don't want that expense to fall on the city. That needs to be paid by the district. Those would be my two concerns about this, but otherwise I agree. Thank you.
Ms. Johnson, then Mr. Beta.
Thank you. I would like to hear Councilman Beta weigh in, since one of the proposals is to consider whether the Budget and Audit Board could provide with consultant support and evaluation. I don't know if that's something that's appropriate for that particular board or not, but I'd like to hear what Councilman Beta has to say.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Beta.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, a couple things. First of all, I have to disagree respectfully with Councilman Skilling on this. As far as our role here, we're taking on a role much more than just as a surrogate for the citizens or the residents, the end users of the district. We're taking on an oversight role at the as to the creation of this district and all of the stuff that goes in it. You know, at some point when the end users finally take over, it's going to be for the most part business as usual. But what we're taking on some serious responsibility, and I have some concerns about that. And kind of as a follow-up to Councilor Harrison, you know, but we're taking on some serious liability. I agree that we don't want to put all of that on our staff. But I don't want to put it all on us either. And us meaning the elected body, because, you know, this is going to take some expertise. So we're going to have to bring in consultants to do it. And I'm wondering just how much, whether we've looked at the legal side of just how much liability we are creating for the city and for our elected officials and for our staff. What's going to be the standard of care here on this? Because if there's problems that come up later and somebody determines that, somewhere we were remiss in our duties, that could create some serious liability. And we're talking about very large numbers here. The other thing is that I want to point out is that with our Budget and Audit Committee, 3 of those members are not elected officials. They're citizens, citizen volunteers. And if we start having the Budget and Audit Committee looking at this, we may be subjecting our 3 non-elected officials to liability as well. So I guess what I would say to Mr. Hutchinson is I think we need to take a real hard look from the legal standpoint of just what kind of responsibility and liability we're creating when we take this kind of responsibility on, which is substantial and which potentially involves a lot of money. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. B. And that's why my comment was I'd like to see, certainly how this is drafted and after it gets through legal. Some of those are my same concerns that you had just mentioned. Ms. Franks?
So I wanted to echo both of you. I have some of those same concerns and wanted to kind of throw out some maybe ways in which to either mitigate or help folks make their decisions. Certainly we may want to look at, like standardized summary sheets. You're going to have counselors who turn over every election cycle or potentially turn over every election cycle. And, there might need to be a whole education process on, what are these? How do you look at them? What are key elements? How do you evaluate them? Because again, everyone comes from a different background. So I think those are things that need to be looked at is, what are we taking on? And then how does a council effectively evaluate them when that may not be something that they're familiar with? So I think standardizing certain elements, maybe there's a report and then key elements go into a summary sheet, which makes it easier for folks to, kind of like a project plan where you have an executive summary. The CEO is never going to read all the detail that a project manager wants to convey, but there's the key things. Are we on time? Are we on budget? What has been the results of key events over the last, X amount of time? So just some things to consider, but I think that echoes both Councilor Beta and Mayor Paul's points. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Kootwine?
Along that same line, one potential thing that may be useful is if, there's kind of this is a standard Metro District proposal, and then highlighting what is unusual or any just special things about this district so that future counselors can easily understand that this is really, kind of like the best practice, or this is quite, this part is unusual. So
Okay.
Just anything that we can give to kind of provide education. And then I think there's even some cities that have like a sort of like a template. So that may be useful as well.
Thank you. All right, folks, is there consensus on 6? Okay, we'll go ahead and move that forward. I think consensus on 7 was pretty easy as far as eminent domain going through the city council. Are there any questions in regards to that? So is there consensus on that? Okay, we'll move that forward. Number 8, if I recall, I don't know, Mr. Skilling, do you want to give a summary, or I think we had pretty good conversation about this, prohibit multi-district structure, underdeveloped affiliates.
Yeah, I think the goal is just to prevent the multi-district organization where you have one district that may not even be a full lot size. It's a 10 by 10 patch of ground, and its only purpose to exist is to have some financial purpose. And as soon as you start doing that, that's when you start losing transparency and you start losing kind of that plain language of what a district is for. So it was just to prevent that. Now, we have heard from folks that there could be circumstances where you want to have multiple districts. Now, the one that I just described is a situation where I think that's what you don't want, is that a district that's doing nothing except doing some financials. And I'll, the cynic would say they're playing financial games, and you might also say, well, that's just the way the structure works out. But there could be a reason, for example, in a multi-use development where you have a commercial piece that is separate from a residential, yet it's the same development, and you may have a separate service district just for the commercial and one separate just for all the residential. And there may be some usefulness to that. And perhaps Jay can speak to that, but that's really the goal, is not to impede efficient districts, like I said, with the commercial versus residential, but is to eliminate the gaming of the system by having multiple districts and complex arrangements that don't need to exist. So that was the goal of that piece.
Yep. Thank you for that. And certainly you described a situation that could happen. So, if council wants to just go forward and prohibit, or if we want to try to put some guardrails around that to address to why is there a case when it comes forth in the service plan, why they would need that, then we'd probably need that language softened a little bit so it's not all out prohibited, but prohibited with some sort of explanation. Ms. Gutwein?
One potential way to address what Councillor Sterling raised would be, maybe to require that there is, a certain amount of development of either commercial or residential within every district. So there can't be a district that has no development, because that's ultimately like what Councillor Skilling was not trying to describe, successfully described, is ultimately what we're trying to prevent. So that could be a way to deal with that.
Thank you for that. Mr. Abel? Looks like you're on mute, sir.
There we go. I agree wholeheartedly. And there's been more than one instance in which the city of Lakewood has approved a piece of property under a guy line at a utility pole, and such small lots that they could never be used for anything commercial or residential. So I think we need to perhaps have a minimal lot size to prohibit that.
So, council, do you want to prohibit altogether? Is there a consensus to prohibit altogether?
I'm not saying prohibit altogether, but we don't want tiny lots.
No, I get that. Then I was going to walk into the next phase. So if we still want to move forward,
there.
Prohibit it. So, okay, we're not going to prohibit altogether. Do we want to direct staff to do some sort of guidelines, whether it's some sort of development in each district or a minimum, something along those lines? And Ms. Franks, while folks are weighing in on that, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that I'd be looking for staff's recommendations. Is it differentiated services, that it's offering two different services? How does that dividing line? But a straight prohibition wouldn't fit well for these blended, maybe large multi-purpose, which we are trying to encourage in areas where we want to see some really diverse development. So I think that I'd be looking to staff to say, what kinds of ways can we put those guardrails up that have, good structure to them? What is that differentiator? That'd be helpful.
Okay. So Mr. Hutchison, does that give you some, okay. All right, council, we're good with that. Okay. Mr. Skilling, Mayor Pro Tem, number 9. We're kind of going through all of this to see if we have just a regular vote or not. So I'm happy to do a check-in with council to see if they want to just prohibit altogether.
Yeah, I think either way, we can certainly, if there's consensus in favor of a full-blown prohibition, I think we could, okay, and there's already some hands on that. That's one approach, or we could do both, have that tonight, but then also reserve it for, as we would in any event, but reserve that too for second reading when it's a formal vote.
Okay. Ms. Harrison, your hand is up.
My question is that what is the ultimate, like, I think Mike talked about it earlier a little bit. If we have a developer that doesn't do all of these things that we're asking them to do, what is our ultimate penalty? What's our stick to get the district back in line? Because that's my concern. We can ask them to do all these things, and probably most of them will comply. But those bad actors, the ones that we're trying to get to, probably won't. What's our stick on this? Thank you.
So, Mr. Hutchison or Mr. Dortick, certainly the initial one for compliance is if they're granted one or not, right? So that's certainly the initial. And then I'm not sure as to the certain, do we set up a penalty phase or what comes along those lines?
We can certainly take a look at options there. Obviously, if they violate the service plan, which would have been approved by City Council, then there's court action that's possible and court orders and those sorts of things. But we'll dig to see if there are other options as well.
And to echo on what Mr. Hutchison just said, we can certainly set up within or require setting up within the special district specific procedures if there is a violation of the district's requirements. And it can vary from specifically set up penalties to just court actions requiring them to comply with their own originating documents.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Skilling?
Now, how this build out would work though is that we're granting them building permits. So we ultimately are the ones that are giving them the keys in the car. And if they stay out too late or get into trouble or whatever violation they're going to do, then we can take back the keys to the car. Yes. We can pull, that would be the legal question. If we're the ones issuing these permits, forget about, assume court action would happen. But if we can have in there a penalty to where if a violation is found, we can pull those permits right back. I can't think of a bigger stick than that. Or have the penalties run the gamut. Why can't we say we can, if there is a substantial violation of the service plan, just like is written into many contracts, if there's a material breach of this, City Council may revoke this service plan. And now you've got a developer who sunk all this money, all this effort, and there's the specter, the sword of Damocles hanging over them that they're going to lose it all. I can't think of a bigger stick. And I don't see any reason why we can't put it in there. Why not?
Thank you for that new word there, Mr. Skilling. Sort of Damocles. Ms. Johnson?
Realistically, I think we all know how long something takes if there's a breach. It can go on for years, and that's just the way it works.
Mr. Beta?
Well, that sounds good, but then I'm wondering what happens to the end user. We've got this half-completed infrastructure. We got a half-completed streets and lights and sidewalks and a clubhouse that's just getting started, and we pull all the building permits. Now the developer goes bankrupt, and the end users, all these people who were paying the taxes, have an unfinished product there. And now where does that go? How does that happen? Does the city then have to take over and be responsible for making sure that this stuff gets done? I sure wouldn't want that responsibility. So it sounds good. Yeah, pull the permits, but then ask yourself, well, where does it go from there? And I don't have the answer.
Okay.
We will, if I may, we will certainly explore a variety of options and try to include all the ones that seem practical and enforceable, with some flexibility for the council on deciding which ones to use to the extent we can. There is one other party that gets caught in this. Sometimes the original developer is not the home builder and sells lots to a home builder who thinks they're going to be able to get a permit, and the permit's issued ultimately to the home builder who isn't the developer and was never involved in the creation of the district and doesn't run the district in some cases. So we do need to be really thoughtful about this. And at the same time, there are some incremental things that happen on developments typically. And you see those whether there's a metro district involved or not. The city has a tool that we utilize called a public improvements agreement. That agreement requires the developer to provide things like streets and sidewalks and drainage and a variety of other things that the city requires and ultimately may own. Before a developer can get building permits, enough infrastructure has to be in place to serve that building that's going to be created. It's a strain on the developers, frankly, but an appropriate one, because when the homeowner shows up, they should be able to drive to their home. They should be able to walk in their neighborhood to some degree. They may not be able to walk all of it yet because it develops in, block by block segments or something. But we'll try to explore ways that we can provide practical enforcement and remedies, while at the same time not creating problems for other parties that we aren't intending to create problems for.
Okay. So with that, on number 9, is there consensus to continue to move this forward to further drafts and potential? Okay. So I'm seeing a yes. All right, Mayor Pro Tem, now we're back to, I think, where we started this evening. So this should fly.
On behalf of the committee, these are recommendations that we did not get into. We even, despite having, I think, 3 meetings on it, I don't think we made it through all of these. So what you heard from Mr. Hutchison earlier tonight is all that we can add from the committee side.
Okay. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you. Sorry about that. On number 10, I guess my questions were, who chooses the consultants and the financial planners? Who pays for that? And what list of qualifications would we be using for those professionals? I think that needs to be identified. I'm not going to wordsmith it or anything tonight, but I think that's a piece that's important to me. I don't want them to be chosen necessarily by the developer. I think they need to be independent somehow. Again, I don't know how that's going to work, but that's my concern. Thank you.
And I would say, again, this goes to what we see in writing. I do have some questions around C3, C4, C8, and then just some further explanation on C9 and C10. I don't need that tonight, but those are going to be a couple things that I'm curious about in the drafting that I may have to come back to with some questions. Council, any other questions on this portion of C10? Okay. Is there a consensus to move that forward? Okay, we'll go ahead and move that forward. Number 11. Are there any questions related to 11? Jay, go ahead, Mr. Skilling.
Only the list here on right before H1, I note that it's, this is kind of that non-exhaustive list. And, we've had experience with this as a council as to what defines material modification. So my only notation that I had made here was, if we're going to have a list, that's fine, but I'd like to see some kind of a catch-all that gives that weighs in favor of us calling it a material modification, and then we go through the challenge process that you've outlined. But I don't want to get in a situation where we're not on all fours with any of these lists, any of the listed items. So there should be some, at the very end, just some catch-all broad terminology that, you know, doesn't fit with the others, but heck, this is a modification. So if you could add, there could be something like that that's kind of in the spirit of a material modification, that would be great. Because that's something that we've lacked in the past, the ability to pull them in and have a hearing or have a discussion to do enforcement. We've lacked that in the past. And I think this entire council, on whatever side of the issue you were on, you at least wanted the ability to discuss it. And we all felt pretty silly not being able to do anything about it, even though, you know, it was worthy of discussion. That was all.
Thank you. Mr. Abel.
Thank you. I would like to, would it be possible for us to, whenever a modification is proposed, that the city council determines whether it's material or whether it's routine? That's my question. And council will determine that solely. Mr. Dortick? Anyone?
I can certainly attempt to answer that question. I'm going to give the caveat that I would generally want more time to give you a complete answer, but I would be very hesitant to put that in council, because then what you're doing is essentially making a quasi-judicial decision, not a legislative decision.
Well, we do make quasi-judicial decisions on occasion. Thank you.
Mr. Beta?
Just venture my thought on it. I think to if you're going to make that a decision by council, you have to have some sort of guideline, and you have to have a way of defining what is and is not material. Otherwise, if you just leave it to council with no guidelines, then our decision becomes arbitrary and capricious, and there's no court in the land will stand for that. So at the very minimum, you got to have guidelines, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that. And I think we have a real case scenario where we had to go through this and it got somewhat political in that some didn't want to take the advice of our attorney, and we ended up having to go throughout the state of Colorado to find somebody who didn't have a conflict, and found out in this world of special districts, kind of everybody knows everybody, and we settled in on somebody in Pueblo, Colorado to engage in our opinion. So I just, for me, would want to understand more or know more, but have to have really strict guidelines around that. Anything else on 11, council? Is there consensus on those? Okay. And then 12, which seemed to make good sense. Any questions on 12? Right? Consensus on 12. Okay. We'll go ahead and move that forward as well. So, Mr. Dortek and Mr. Hutchison, thank you very much. Mr. Skilling, certainly thank you. And the Development Dialogue Committee, you've put in a ton of work on this subject in a lot of different meetings, and certainly the community members engaged. Ms. Hodson, I don't know if you're ready for kind of what the next steps look like, or if you want to come back next Monday with kind of an idea of what a timeline could look like for council.
Yeah, I appreciate that. How about if we do an update next Monday after staff has had a chance to kind of review all the comments that were given today, and then we'll come up with a recommended time frame for first and second reading.
Okay. Is that cool, council? Anything else that you might have for this subject tonight? Again, I'm super proud of you. This is huge. In the last couple of meetings, we really moved through a lot. Now, the next, when we have a draft, it's going to be a little bit different, right? We're going to have truly the minutia, but thank you. So with that, are there City of Lakewood Council Committee reports from any of our chairs tonight? Mr. Skilling.
So I would just, this is kind of, I don't have anything in the future, but just along the same lines that you had just mentioned, I would like to thank the Development Dialogue Committee members. We did 3 sessions on this. I'd like to thank the residents. We had a lot of public comment. We were during that time period where we were piloting that real-time system, which was really cool, where we had comments as we were discussing. They were coming in and we could all see it on the screen. So thank you to staff for that. And Mr. Parker and Laura and everyone that came along with that. And thank you, obviously, to the committee members who did a lot of work with that. So the resident staff and the committee, I think, put in a lot of time and effort and will continue to do so. But I think we're a lot closer than we were. And so I look forward to seeing this on first and second reading, and this being, hopefully a model ordinance for the rest of the state, and certainly for the state legislature.
Thank you. Ms. Vincent, housing.
Yes, we'll have a Housing Policy Commission meeting this Wednesday at 6 p.m. and we will be discussing short-term rentals and the information that council gave us to review. And that will be via Zoom.
Great, thank you. Ms. Gutwein?
Thank you. The legislative session, as you all know, is over for the year. And so our legislative committee had our last regular meeting a little bit ago, and we will be meeting again at a date to be determined to just kind of go through a wrap up and look at all the bills that have been signed and just follow up on the bills that we have been following. But just really want to thank everyone in the committee for a lot of hard work and a lot of challenging discussions that were very respectful of differences of opinion, and really want to thank our staff liaison as well. Ben did a phenomenal job. He does a lot of work for that committee. And I think that we were able to really make a difference on some very big bills this year. So thanks to all.
Thank you. Mr. Beta?
Thank you, Mayor. Budget and Audit Committee, we are working on setting up a meeting of the Budget and Audit Committee shortly. We've got a number of things to go over. So that'll be coming up. And then, Mayor, with your permission, I'd just like to announce that we will have our Ward 3 meeting this Saturday, virtual meeting, 9 o'clock. That's all. Thank you.
Mr. Abel?
Thank you, Mayor. Certainly not the chair. Ms. Gutwein did a great job with the legislative committee this year. Unfortunately, for 3/4 of the legislative session, Ward 1 was not represented on the legislative committee, and therefore Ward 1 lost our voice for some time on the issues that were coming before the legislature. In fact, I believe we went 5 months of the 6.5 months the legislature was in session without having that voice on the committee. I think in the future, when there is an opening, policies and procedures should be followed immediately, and an appointment brought to council within 2 weeks. Thank you.
All right, council. Well, thank you for all your hard work tonight, and certainly the committees that you serve on. We will see you next week. Take care.